Hi everybody, my name is Michelle and this is going to be my insanely huge January reading wrap up. Somehow in January I read a total of 15 books. I don't know exactly how it happened, but it happened. And what is even more amazing is that some of these books, like 4 of these books, are 5-star reads. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this is one of the best reading months I have ever had. I was just in the complete best reading mood ever. I loved reading, I had such a good time reading, and I read amazing books. I think that also helps, of course. So yeah, in this video I'm going to tell you all about those books and what I loved about them, and yeah, basically all the books that I read in January. So yeah, let's just get started because I feel like this video is already going to be long enough as it is. And let me tell you all about the books that I read in January. The very first book that I finished in January and also in this year is Educated by Tara Westover. This book is a non-fiction book about Tara's life because she grew up in a family of survivalists, basically like in the mountains. Also, her family was very strictly religious and very much off the grid, so she never went to school. She didn't even have a birth certificate until she was 9 years old. So it's all about her growing up in that very unusual environment, and also about how later in life she does go to school and she finds out that she's actually pretty good at school. And yeah, and then she starts to see how her life with her family is not a life most people lead. So this book was insane. I loved it so much. This is the first 5-star read that I was talking about. Educated was beautifully written. I really loved how the story was being told. Tara is like an amazing writer. She writes so well and so engaging. So that is what makes the story so interesting and so unique and just beautiful to read about. Even though the things that she writes about aren't all that beautiful, because there were a lot of things in her childhood that were, well, not usual, but also not all that okay, especially with her father. There were things that yeah, it's just you read about it and you can almost not imagine how it must be like. And you feel for Tara in certain moments, but you also just love being on this journey with her and reading about her life. And again, it was just so gorgeously written. I could not get enough of it. I think that's one of the biggest plus points of this book, is that the writing style is just so engaging. And then of course the story itself is also very interesting to read about. And this is basically one of the books that I wanted to read more non-fiction, and this is a very good one. I was very happy with it and it really made me very happy to read it. And as I mentioned before, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Then my second read was Silicas Journey by Heather Morris. This is the sequel to The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and this book tells the story of a woman named Silke Klein, who was also a real life character and someone from the Tattooist of Auschwitz. This book tells her story after the Second World War and how she gets in another prisoners camp. So yeah, it is, don't want to say too much, but it is very emotional and very well written again. So I read The Tattooist of Auschwitz last year and I really loved that book. It was amazingly written and so heartbreaking and raw. And then came along Silicas Journey and I loved this one maybe even more. Well, certainly even more. I don't know why, but maybe, I don't know. I felt like the writing style was a bit smoother in this one, a bit more easy to get through. Well, that's not the right word, because The Tattooist of Auschwitz is very easy to get through, but this one felt more like a book, or I don't know. The Tattooist of Auschwitz sometimes felt like it made big jumps and that it was going very fast. And this book also goes by fast at some points, but it also feels more like a wholesome story in the writing. Like, it's not that The Tattooist of Auschwitz, that it's not a wholesome story, but it's purely with like the writing, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job at explaining how I felt about this book, but that's sort of the idea. I love to read about Silke as a main character. She was so interesting and so sweet, and some of it is like a true story, some of it is made up and fictionalized, and also like in the epilogue or like the you know, author's note, there is information about what is real and what is not. But overall, Silicas Journey was a very engaging book, and again something that I enjoyed so much to read, and I flew through it and I love to be on this journey with Silke and all the other characters, and it was just so beautiful. It left me with so many emotions and it was just I don't know how to describe it, but it's a very good Well, it's not technically World War II, but also a little bit. It's just a very good historical fiction book. Let's leave it at that. I really enjoyed it, and also I feel like people are going to wonder, you can read Silicas Journey without reading The Tattooist of Auschwitz, because it's a story on its own and there are references and you know, some things about her and her relationship with the characters from The Tattooist of Auschwitz, but you don't have to read it, so you can read this one straight away. It's not like you cannot follow it if you haven't read the first book, if that makes sense. And I gave this one also 5 stars. Yeah, loved it very much. My next read was The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. This is the first book in the, well, is it called the, I don't know, what is it called? The Eldest Curses. The first book in the Eldest Curses series, which takes place in between the Mortal Instruments series, in between City of Glass and City of Fallen Angels. And this book follows Magnus and Alec as the main characters. I don't want to say much more apart from that, but yeah, it follows them and also some other characters that you know from future series and past series. So yeah, it is a Shadowhunter book. I listened to the audiobook and yeah, this one has already been out for a year, but even though I love Shadowhunter books, it took me a while to pick it up, and that's mostly because I'm just not the biggest Magnus and Alec fan. Like, I like them, and of course I think they're very cute and I love to read about them, but I don't like them as the main characters, if that makes sense. But I did finally pick it up and I was sort of right with my feeling. Yeah, I had some mixed feelings towards this book. So the good things are of course the characters, because those are always very cute and it's nice to see some more of characters that we know and love, more information and more backstory, and yeah, that always makes me happy. Also, there's definitely humor in this book. I always love that of the Shadowhunter books. They can be so funny, and this one has that as well. And overall it's just a fun Shadowhunter book, so I'm always going to enjoy those. Yeah, because you know, they're nice, they're enjoyable. But then for the bad, I think it's mostly again, because I'm just not the biggest fan of Magnus and Alec, that they didn't always do it for me. Like, I wasn't always fully invested into their story. Also because it's in Midwall and it takes place in between the Mortal Instruments series, I have trouble being invested into the story because I know what's going to happen after that. I know where they're going to end up. I know what's going to happen next. So, you know, there are certain things that aren't going to happen. Like, you know that the tense moments are not that tense because you know what's going to happen, you know? Yeah, that makes it a bit less interesting for me to read about. Also, you know, the writing style is good and the characters are so much more developed. But the thing is, they aren't that developed at this point in the Mortal Instruments series, so it feels very out of place for me, because there's so much more character to Magnus and Alec, and of course we get that in the later books, but in the place where this should be in the story, in the timeline, it doesn't make sense, because you know, you grow with Magnus and Alec, and with this book you feel like you're growing even more, but that doesn't make sense because they're still very much at the beginning of the entire Shadowhunter story. So that is something that confuses me a bit. So in the end I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because it's fine, it's enjoyable, but it's not a very exciting Shadowhunter book in my opinion. It's nice and I'm probably going to read the next book, but it's also a bit meh. Then after that, I read my very first Stephen King book, and that was Misery. So yeah, never read anything by Stephen King before this one, and Misery was the first. And this book is about an author named Paul, and he gets in a car accident and then he gets rescued by a woman who nurses him back to health. But this woman also turns out to be his #1 fan, because Paul is an author. Did I say that? Oh my god, I'm like all over the place with this wrap up. He's an author of the Misery book series. The main character is a woman named Misery, historical fiction, everything. And the woman, Annie Walker, is his #1 fan, but then she discovers that he has killed Misery off in the last book, and she's not agreeing with that. She's very much not pleased with that. So this book, I really loved it. It was so tense and there were so many on the edge of your seat moments. It is something different, I will say that, because the book was a bit slower than I had expected, and a lot of it is just inner monologue in Paul's head and him thinking about things. But I also sort of liked it because it was very interesting to get more of an insight in his thoughts and ideas. And yeah, of course, the situation where he finds himself in is very interesting and very scary and creepy and intense. And also Annie Walker, like, oh, I just love how yeah, creepy she is, and she's definitely a character. So I loved that about it, and I loved that the writing style was a bit different than I am used to. It is something, yeah, I don't know, it's interesting, but I really loved it. It was so exciting and so tense. I'm also happy that it wasn't too big. Like, I didn't want to have a very big first Stephen King book. This one is very manageable, and I will say though, some of the parts that were misery books weren't really my cup of tea, so those were a bit more boring to me, but overall it was really good. And yeah, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's like 1 star less because sometimes it felt a bit too slow, but yeah, it wasn't that bad. So overall it was still a very good book that I very much enjoyed, and I will most definitely be reading more Stephen King in the future. For my next book, I did a reread of one of my favorites, and that is the Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. So I feel like everybody knows this book, but just in case you don't, this book is about a magical circus that only appears at night, or is only open at night, and it appears out of nowhere. And it turns out that this circus is sort of is connected to a magical duel between 2 sorcerers, or like magicians, if that sounds a bit better. Yeah, this book is one of my favorites. I read it 3 years ago, and I thought it was definitely time for a reread. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Jim Dale, who does the American Harry Potter books, and I really liked his narrating. He does voices very well, I think, and I was so like, oh, I loved my reread of this so much. It is so beautiful and so magical, and I'm so happy that I still love it as much as I did the first time around. I felt the atmosphere again, I felt the characters again. It was just so amazing to be on this magical ride and with all these beautiful stories and characters, and Erin Morgenstern really knows how to create this atmosphere where you as a reader are entranced by everything that is happening, and I loved it very much. So now that I've reread this, I really should be going with like getting a start on the Starless Sea, which is her next book. Still haven't read that, but I felt like I had to reread this one first, and I'm very happy that I did. It's 5 out of 5 stars. Oh, maybe that's then like, I have more 5 stars than 4 or 5 stars, but this is a reread, so I didn't really count it towards it. But The Night Circus is of course a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I also listened to a couple of thriller audiobooks in January, and I'm going to do these a bit more quickly because with most of these I didn't have a lot of deep thoughts on it. So, you know, sort of like rapid round of reviews. The first one was The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell. This was by far my favorite out of the thriller audiobooks that I've listened to. The Family Upstairs takes place, well, it doesn't take place, it's told from 2 different perspectives, or 3 different perspectives. It's about this house where there was once this family, but then sort of another family moved in with them, and there was this sort of cult. And then there's also 25 years later, where there is a girl who used to be like a baby that was found in this house. Like, this sounds really not that well. Yeah. Long story short, there's this house where 3 people were found dead and some people missing, and there was this baby, and she's now grown up, and she gets back to the house, and there are more people involved, and yeah, it's just a story with bits and pieces from different points of view. The book is not as confusing as I made it out to be, but yeah, this one I really enjoyed because, I don't know, it felt like it was, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It was more of, I had more of a connection with this one. It was so easy to listen to. I think that's the most important part. And also all the different stories felt interesting, all the different points of view, and the story overall is interesting. And also I like that it's a thriller, but it's also not too thrillery, which is the same feeling I had with another book by Lisa Jewell that I read, which was Then She Was Gone. It's sort of like the writing style of her that speaks to me, and this one had the exact same feeling. Like, it's not an all-time favorite, but it's so enjoyable, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then the next book I listened to was The Party by Robin Harding. This was quite a bad one. I didn't enjoy this one at all. The Party is about a girl named Hannah who turns 16, and she has a sleepover party at her house, but then things go wrong, and those things have consequences. And this book was so weirdly paced, and I did not know exactly what was happening all the time and where it was leading to. It felt like the book was leading to something, but then it sort of didn't. Also, all the characters in this book are horrible. Like, most of them are just horrible characters to read about. They're not nice, they're selfish, they're annoying, and also all of them. So I wasn't really rooting for anybody. And also I felt like it was very not consequent with its characters and their development and their personality. It was just all over the place. Sometimes they did something that felt so out of place and out of character, and yeah, I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I did not like this one at all. And then the final audiobook was Behind Her Eyes by Sarah Binborough, which is about 3 people. There are Adele and David, who are married, and then there's Louisa, who is sort of like in an affair with David and is best friends with Adele, and there's a lot of creepy stuff going on. This one was a bit weird because overall it was okay, and the entire book was sort of working towards something, but then the ending was so weird. And the ending could have been good, like in theory I liked it, but it didn't completely fit with the rest of the book in my opinion. So the rest of the book was a bit too boring and a bit too slow, and then the ending felt so much more tense and exciting and thrillery, and that wasn't really what I wanted because it felt so conflicting with each other. I felt like the entire book should be more intense if you want that weird of an ending. And I didn't feel like an intense connection to the rest of it, so it was okay, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It's really not really worth talking about. I don't have a lot of things to say about it. But now we're getting back to the good stuff, because the next book that I read is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. This book is about a girl named Kia who is very much alone, and she lives in this sort of marsh, which is sort of like a swamp, and she's very much by herself, and she grows up there. And during her life she also has some relationships with 2 different boys, or like a connection. But then in present day, a boy named Chase Andrews is found dead, and all the clues lead to her being the suspect. This book was insane. I loved it so much, and most of the book is about Kaya's life and her growing up and her relationship with the marsh and all the animals that live there, and like you know, the nature, and it was very interesting to read about that. But I mostly loved reading about her as a character and her growing up, and oh, it was so beautiful and so tragic, and so I don't have words for it because it was just absolutely gorgeous. I will say though, maybe like the final third of the book, where it turns more into like a crime novel, I still enjoyed, but maybe a bit less than the first 2/3, because that was mostly about Kia, and it's just, oh my god, I cannot really explain why I loved it so much, but mostly because Kia is such an amazing main character to read about, and I felt so much for her in certain situations, and it was just beautifully written, and so I could see the surroundings of where she lived, and you know, how she lived, and it was just, it gave me all the feelings. Like there was so much chemistry in this book, and it was just beautiful. It might be a bit of a short review, but that's really all I can say about it. It was very good, and I really loved it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars because it was amazing. My next book was another reread. It was Sleeping Giants by Sylvain Neuvel, and I reread this one by listening to the audiobook. This is a sci-fi novel, and it's about Dr. Rose Franklin, who as a child finds a mysterious, huge robotic hand, and then as an adult she is involved into the project of finding the other parts that might belong to this robot, and yeah, there might be more to this thing that we don't know about. It is told in the format of files, so transcripts and journals and interviews, which makes this very interesting. I reread this because it was one of my favorite reads of last year. It is amazing. It is like sci-fi for people who don't usually like sci-fi, I guess, because it is so accessible even if you don't like sci-fi, and it's just very interesting to read about. The audiobook was amazing. Like there was an entire cast of characters, of like narrators who did all the characters, which made it even more interesting, and yeah, I was so excited to be rereading this, and I really loved the story. I felt like the audiobook was even more amazing than reading it physically. The sad thing is though that the second and third book are now removed from my audiobook library, which is yeah, very sad, because I wanted to reread the entire series and now I can't, which is very, very heartbreaking, but I'll have to find another way to get those audiobooks, because this one was so good, and now I want to reread book 2 and 3 as well. And if you want to read some sci-fi but you usually don't read sci-fi, then read this one, because it's perfect to start out with, and it's so interesting and tense at times and exciting and funny and everything. it's a very good book in my opinion. The next book that I finished is actually a Dutch book, and it's called Cant For indignation by Tatjana Almouli, which would translate as Pretty for a Fat Girl. It's all about Tatjana's experience as growing up, well, fat, and how she has dealt with that. And she was also a participant in a, you know, TV show where fat people lose a lot of weight, so she did that, but after that she gained weight again, and it's all about her accepting who she is and about dealing with fat shaming and her life and also her other mental health problems. This book was very interesting to read about. There was a lot that I found very interesting about her childhood and, you know, how certain things you don't really think about it, and how anybody, like everyone around you, thinks they can say something if you're fat because they always say it's about your health and mostly it isn't really, and how she constantly got commentary on her appearance always. How losing a lot of weight very quickly on that show wasn't really all that good for her, because after that all her hormones were mixed up and she gained weight even more quickly. Yeah, it's all about that and her experience, and doing more research about body positivity and you know, more facts about weight and getting fat and what people might not know about it. So that is everything that I loved about it. Especially one thing that she said rang very true to me, and that is that people often have comments or critique on her, and then they say it's because of your health. But when someone is thin and they also, or like maybe even more so, eat very unhealthily, you know, lots of fast food and everything, nobody says anything about it because they're skinny, so they don't think they are unhealthy. So that's one thing that I really liked about it. But then on the other hand, what I didn't really like about this book is after a while it gets very whiny. And I don't mean to say that experience with fat shaming is whiny. It's more like the way it was written, and also how Tatjana at some point, you know, like she was talking about the entire world as if everybody was against her, even though she also had supporting friends, and like it didn't matter what they said or what they didn't said, it was never good enough. So that got a bit annoying after a while. Again, it's more, I think, in the writing and the wording than the actual experience. It's just, I felt like there could have been a bit more information and a bit less of her life, and how, you know, everybody is always against her, not people in her life, but basically the entire world. I felt like it was very passive, if that makes sense. Of course, there is a lot that isn't okay with the world when it comes to fat shaming and everything, but it felt very passive, like everything was happening to her, whilst like in every situation there are always things you can do yourself, and it felt like a bit like she left those things out of the conversation, if that makes sense. But okay, overall it was a good book and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then for my next read I picked up The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, and you can probably tell from my face that I really like this book. This is a fantasy book that takes place in medieval Russia, and yeah, it's about a girl named Vasya who grows up there. And very much the entire story is about Russian folklore and myth-inspired things and magic that is being involved and dangers, and how Vasya is someone who has the power to stop that, and also about her being, I don't know, a bit more in connection with those magical elements. It is really hard to explain the premise because the premise is so, yeah, it's very hard to explain the book in one premise because there's so much more to the story than just that. What I can tell you is that this book is wonderful. It is so magical and beautiful and interesting to read about. Lots of people were saying that it's a bit slow, but I didn't even find it that slow at all because I was just flying through it. I could not get enough of the story. It was so addictive. It was very atmospheric, and Vasya was amazing as a main character. And what I also like is Vasya is the main character, but we also see things from other points of view and other characters, and I just really love being in other heads and see things differently. And the writing is just, you feel like you're in that world with the characters, and it feels so beautiful and magical, and it's more of like an experience, and you really should read it for yourself to know what I'm talking about. What I want to say basically is don't feel intimidated by this book because it might be slower sometimes or it sounds a bit too fantastical, because it's just, I don't know, it's so beautiful. I will say though, the second half was maybe a little bit less interesting than the first half, but overall it was still such an amazing book. and I love the conclusion and the ending, and I just love everything about it. So this was also a book that I gave 5 out of 5 stars because it was beautiful and it was just gorgeous, and yeah, one of my new favorites again. After that, I also read the second book, The Girl in the Tower, which is the second book in this series. And yeah, with this I basically have the same thoughts as the first one. I think I like the second one even more because it sort of expands the world, and that's all I can say again. But yeah, this was also 5 out of 5 stars. Like, I can basically say the exact same thing I said about the first one because it was just amazing. I think I like this one even bit better, but yeah, long story short, this one is also amazing. The entire series is amazing. We're getting towards the end, don't worry, but the next book that I read in January was Blue Lily, Lily Blue by Maggie Stiefvater, and this is the third book in the Raven Cycle series. This is a series that follows a group of boys that are called the Raven Boys, and they are on this quest to find a mysterious Welsh king named Glendower. And then there's also a girl named Blue who is being told that she's cursed and that she will cause her true love to die when she kisses him. But it is a contemporary at the same time. It does take place in like our world, in like America. So yeah, it sounds a bit more fantastical than it actually is. Yeah, this is the third book, and yeah, it was so definitely time for me to pick up the third book because it had been more than a year since I read the second book, and I really did enjoy the first and the second book. And I did not know why it took me so long to continue with the series, but I finally did. And Blue Lily, Lily Blue was also an amazing one, very good. I will say though, for me, like, the Raven Cycle series is just good and not incredible. And I feel like for a lot of people the series is incredible, and for me it's just, you know, it's nice, it's interesting, it's okay. What I mostly like is the writing style because it's so amazing and whimsical and magical, and that's just something that I love very much in books. And this book was no exception to that. I also, with parts, listened to the audiobook, which is also very well narrated. Maybe it should be your thing because there is like a heavy accent with the audiobook, like a heavy southern accent. But overall, you know, it is very interesting, and I love to see how this story is going to continue and how the characters are going to end up. I also loved some of the humor because at times this book can be very funny and, you know, sort of like deadpan humor out of nowhere, and that's something that I can always appreciate. But then again, I also think that sometimes it's a bit too slow and a bit too boring. That's why probably I will never love it as incredibly much as some people, but overall it was a very good third installment in a series, and I will be finishing it hopefully in February. Yeah, it was a good book. Okay, so we made it to the final book, and that one is After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this was another reread. I listened to the audiobook, which was again very enjoyable. After I Do is about Lauren and Ryan, and they have been married for quite some time, but currently they aren't getting along very well. And in order to save their marriage, they decide to take 1 year off of being married and don't have any contact with each other. And during the year, Lauren learns a lot about love and about life and about who she is and what she wants from her marriage and from her life in general. So this is my favorite book of Taylor Jenkins Reid after The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones. So I guess sort of my favorite book of her older books. It is a contemporary and it's about love, but what I like is that there's more depth to it and more, I don't know, story to it than with most romance contemporaries. And I love the message, and I loved how this book tells you how, you know, it's okay to experience love in different ways. You can make your own rules. You don't even have to be in a relationship if you don't want to. It's just about all the different kinds of things, and that's something that I enjoy. And the audiobook was very pleasant to listen to. As I said, it is a reread, so I don't have any deep new thoughts about it. It is something that I would very much recommend. It is an easy one to get through, an easy book to read. So that's what I liked about it, and it was also, again, a pleasant audiobook to listen to. And I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. And we're finally there! That was it for my January reading wrap up. I feel like I've been talking for hours. Let's try to keep this video not too long. Yeah, I'm very happy with all the books that I read, and I hope you enjoyed all my reviews about them. And hopefully February will also be amazing with reading, so excited for it. And yeah, as you can tell, I read a lot of amazing books, which makes me very happy. But this was it now for this video, and if you liked this video, please go subscribe or maybe give it a thumbs up, because as always, I would really appreciate that. And hopefully I will see you again very soon in my next video. Bye!